Okay, so today we're going to talk about Northup and kind of do a Q&A. Make sure you're kind of ready for the quiz. That's going to be tomorrow. I did kind of record a little bit of a review. We're going to go into a little more detail here in class, but the video clip right there is just kind of like a 3-minute, like these are the big ideas you need to focus on. But like I said, we'll kind of dive into that, make sure you really kind of understand it. And you can ask me questions about the book or whatever. So we'll just kind of meander through that. The quiz itself will have 17 questions. 2 of them are multiple choice. The rest of them are short answer. By short answer, I mean 3 to 5 sentences, thereabouts. I tried to make sure the questions were specific so that you would know specifically what to say. I'm not looking for you to write an essay. I'm looking for you to show me that you understand the question. And I tried to pick questions, or I created questions that were related directly to the book, not to the movie.
Do we get to use the book?
No. Okay. You don't use the book because, in my experience, first off, that causes people to spend too much time looking at the book and not answering the question. And oftentimes they can get distracted what they think, and then they look in the book and they get confused. And it also gives an unfair advantage to somebody that didn't really read the book. And so, yeah.
So will you tell us, like, on the quiz, will you tell us, like, where it is in the book? Or, like,
No.
Like, chapter-wise?
No. The questions aren't like that. Questions are kind of analysis, synthesis kind of questions.
So
right?
It's not like
what happened in chapter 10. No, it's not like that.
Okay. So it's more like
because
this happened, what happened next?
Exactly. It's more like that kind of thing. Yeah. And when we go through kind of discussing it today, I think it'll make a little more sense. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to kind of I know exactly what I want to cover, and this will kind of remind you. So if you get home and you're like, okay, what did she say? Then you can kind of watch that video and all that kind of stuff. So we'll take the quiz tomorrow. My experience has been with the other classes, and especially because this was the class that had the fire alarm, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the other classes haven't, like, I think 5th period we lectured for about, 15 minutes, I think, about exploration. The other classes haven't even gotten to it. Last class we had 10 minutes left, and it was just kind of like, I just didn't feel like forcing them to sit through a lecture. So I've got to decide. I'm leaning towards maybe recording the rest of the exploration lecture. If so, I'll be able to tell you by tomorrow. Okay. So you'll kind of know that in advance if that's what I do. If not, then we'll do it next Tuesday. Now my plan next Tuesday is to talk about the essay question because that's coming up. So I will. So we'll talk about that Tuesday. And then we'll finish up. Either we'll go straight to the conquest documents if I record. If I don't record, then we'll go straight to the lecture and then do the conquest documents. I can tell you right now, my inclination is to record the rest of the exploration lecture so that way we can move on. So, that being said, let's get started. We're going to start by watching a movie, or not a movie, a video. You're like, darn. I want to watch a movie. Anyway, so we got a couple videos to watch that I think will kind of help flesh out some of the information you have.
What made cotton so desirable? A perfect storm. In the 1790s, America's oldest crops, like tobacco, were depleting farmland and dropping in value. At the same time, the textile industry in Great Britain was exploding, creating enormous international demand for cotton clothing. Eli Whitney's gin merely provided the motor for a global economic machine, and slavery was its fuel.
Everybody was getting a piece of it. All these northern bankers and marketing people, folks who owned the ships that transported the cotton, everybody was getting a piece of the pie.
Cotton utterly transformed the United States. making fertile land from Georgia to Texas extraordinarily valuable. The fact that Native Americans lived on these lands was a temporary inconvenience, solved by a policy of Indian removal. The massive replacement of native populations with slave plantations. It's a part of our troubled history that can still be seen from the air.
If we were flying over this prior to European settlement, we would have seen large fields of corn and beans, trees, and squash. When the first English began moving in here, they began chopping down the trees and expanding the fields available for cotton.
The enormous profitability of cotton undermined the principles of the American Revolution and forever altered black life. The more money the planters made from growing cotton, the more cotton the planters wanted to grow, and that took more slaves. Slaves in the Upper South became incredibly more valuable as commodities because of this demand for them in the Deep South. They were sold off in droves, and that created a second Middle Passage. And in many ways, the second Middle Passage was just as devastating as the first. To feed King Cotton, more than 1 million African Americans were carried off into the Deep South. That's 2.5 times the number that were brought to the United States from Africa. It was the largest forced migration in American history.
Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea about the economic forces that we know were at work. It's when you think about the existence of slavery in the United States, on one hand, you think about the Constitution and you think, oh, well, how could they do that? Well, understand that when they create the Constitution and they create the 3/5 compromise that says that for representation purposes in the southern states, slaves are worth 3/5 of a person, so they can count towards representation, even though they aren't counted as actual citizens or people, right? So how do we go from that compromise? Why does that compromise come into being? Well, some of it is that some of the people, some of the founding fathers are pro-slavery, right? There's just no way around that. Some of them, however, are not pro-slavery. And what they think is that slavery is going to phase itself out. That the tobacco industry is no longer as profitable. It's not the cash crop that it once was. And so there's this perception that maybe that's going to fade away. Eli Whitney's cotton gin is created as a labor-saving device. Well, the only reason you want to save labor is to have fewer laborers. So even when you're talking about cotton circa 1800, what you're talking about is a mindset that said, we want to do this without slaves. Now, what changes is the textile boom, right? And that happens in the early 1800s. And it happens at the same time that the international slave trade is phased out for the United States. This was part of that great compromise that in 1808, no more international slave trade. And so that is going to create this demand for slaves that come from the East, that come from Virginia, North Carolina, and go into the Deep South specifically for cotton. And even though they have a cotton gin, there's western expansion, there's ever-growing land, there's this idea of opportunity. Because cotton is cash crop. People could make a lot of money. They could also lose a lot of money, right? It's agriculture. It's volatile. It goes up and down. So it's kind of a win-lose situation. Sometimes you get involved in cotton and you'll make a fortune. Sometimes you get involved in cotton and you go broke. But all of that's going to depend on being able to get people to help you pick the cotton. And that's where the slave resources come in. And so you have this kind of push in, 1810, 1820, especially by the time you get to 1830, where there's a lot of, taking people from, kind of the mid-Atlantic states and selling them into the Deep South. And it is incredibly disruptive, very much so. So that's kind of the economic circumstances about why this occurs. Like, you don't understand why Northup's kidnapped if you don't appreciate that he's exceptionally valuable. He's exceptionally valuable because of the economics of the time. He's also exceptionally valuable because he's talented. And that's part of the conversation that the two guys have with him at the beginning. Oh, you can play the violin, really? Well, gee whiz, right? So they have a reason for wanting to do that, okay? This next video talks about Northup's descendants, and I think it does a pretty good job of kind of giving you maybe a little bit of an uplift about the end of the story, because there's a lot about the story that can be kind of depressing.
I am the fourth great-granddaughter to Solomon Northup.
Solomon Northup is my fourth great-grandfather.
And my third great-grandfather.
I am a third-generation great-granddaughter of Solomon.
Great times three.
I am the great-granddaughter of Solomon Northup.
Solomon Northup is an excellent player on the violin.
I was born a free man, lived with my family in New York,
Be good for your mother.
till the day I was deceived,
To Solomon.
kidnapped, sold into slavery.
I knew about it, but I never knew about the whole story. I never actually read the book, but when I saw the movie, it made me more proud, like, oh wow, really, I'm part of his legacy.
The river Jordan,
That servant
That don't obey his Lord.
shall be beaten with many stripes.
That's scripture.
Initially, it was very hard for me to watch, just because knowing that it was someone who had a hand in creating me, who went through so much. There were points in the movie which I just couldn't watch. It felt like I was Solomon. It felt like it was me. That one of those visceral feelings.
You hear the truth, but you don't really actually see the truth.
I had mixed feelings. I was upset because that happened, but I was excited that I finally got to see this real thing, and it helped me understand more.
Even if I wasn't related, I would have been like, it's a good movie. I'm glad a movie like this came out. I'm just fortunate to be my fourth great-grandfather.
Watching the movie so many times, I just feel like Jules Hell's my grandfather. Solomon Northup. That's him right there.
Proud. Very proud that we had somebody great in their family.
He's a part of history now. Before it was just a book, and now it's this movie directed by Steve McQueen. Everyone knows who Steve McQueen is, and Brad Pitt.
I will survive. I will not fall into despair. I will keep myself hardy till freedom is opportune.
I'm hoping that it will go into the schools. I'm hoping that it will go into all history books. It's America's history, because you see where we came from a long time ago, and where we're going to go from there. We see progress. And I think the movie brought out more love than hatred.
I hope that at a point in time that it comes where we don't have Black History Month and that we just have American history, because this is all of our history. It's not just my history, it's not just my family's history, it's the American story. It's a part of our history. Slavery helped to create the infrastructure of this great country that we live in, and I would like to see the history books documented showing that fact.
Okay, so So that shows you a little bit about kind of the end of the story. And the end of the story is, if you remember from the intro, there were a couple of articles that I linked at the very beginning that talked, one was from the Wall Street Journal, one was from NPR, that basically said that we don't know what happened to Solomon. We know that he's free, he goes home, that's where the book ends. We know that when the book ends, he attempts to take Birch and his business associate to court, and to, in order for them to be held accountable for what they did. But because it's Maryland, which is a slave state, and the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., while it's its own entity, it's within that slave state. So slavery was permitted, which means that in that area, that he wasn't allowed to testify, okay? So this makes it so that it's very difficult for them to prove their case.
Wait, but he's a free man now in this case.
He is, but he's a black man.
Oh, so there's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll get there. That's one of the concepts I want to hit on. So we know that he takes it to court, that nothing comes of that. He goes back to Saratoga Springs, writes a story. That sells some books. He makes a little bit of money. He's able to buy a house. Then he goes from there. He creates a play. He then reinvests a lot of the money he got from the book into this play. Now, this was a common scenario. It was certainly something we saw done with Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was immensely popular. It made a ton of money. They turned it into a play. The play made a ton of money. And so Northup, I think, is, first off, there's that little bit of throwing shade at Harriet Beecher Stowe because, who is she as a white woman to write this story, right? And so I think that, there's a little bit of that. I think he's following that model, and I think, there's an economic interest as well as I want the story to get out, okay? So the play is kind of a flop, really. And so he loses some money with that. And what we know is that he kind of disappears. We know that his wife, his children, of course, are, pretty close to grown when he comes back. So they're kind of independent. We know that he leaves, and his wife is kind of on her own. Now, I can tell you that a few years ago, I was in New York City, and there's a house that's in, and I can't remember which borough it is, but I want to say was it Harlem? I could be wrong, but I want to say it was Harlem. Anyways, it was a house that Aaron Burr's widow had owned, okay? So so there's an Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr connection. So this house was actually a house that George Washington had stayed at, which is why I initially went there. And so I'm there, and I'm touring the house, and the docent's talking. And she said, oh, the movie 12 Years a Slave. She said, Solomon Northup's wife was a cook for Aaron Burr's widow. And, and that she had a good relationship, that one of her sons had lived with her and had worked there, and was apparently supposedly close with Aaron Burr's widow, and was supposed to receive some money from her upon her death, and the family didn't want to give him that money, and so he wasn't able to kind of get that. So it's kind of an interesting, as somebody who teaches 12 Years a Slave, it was interesting to me to hear that she ends up in New York City. She's still doing what she was doing in Saratoga Springs, which is acting as a cook, and that you still see them trying to work their way up in society, or in the world rather. And so but what happens to him, we don't know. He kind of disappears. But we know that his descendants, right, survive. His kids have kids. And so I kind of like showing that clip because it does a really good job of kind of giving you a sense that maybe the story really ultimately does have a happy ending. And it also shows some good clips from the movie. So you have, so those clips hopefully kind of get you in the mindset. I will say one thing about the intro assignment. First off, Wyatt told me that the third question was very complicated. So I listened to that critique, and so basically all I'm going to look for in the third question is kind of a good faith effort, right? Did you attempt to answer the question? If it's kind of messy or confusing, don't stress.
I didn't answer it under 3. I went back up. Is that okay?
Okay, that's fine. Okay, yeah. I am going to look at kind of the chart that you created about the different narratives. I'm going to look for, do you recognize the difference between the authors, kind of some of the story, some of the broad strokes about their story, because I want to see that you kind of familiarized yourself with the different ones. Then, of course, the first question is a pretty easy one, right? So don't stress about the third question. The other thing I'll say is, while technically it's due at midnight tonight, I'm not going to grade it tomorrow, and so it'll be Saturday before I touch it. So if I haven't started grading it, then I don't consider it late, because that seems unfair to hold you to a standard that I'm not then following myself.
So for the diagram, do you want like I did it on paper? Do you want us to take a picture, scan it?
You can just turn it in on paper. I don't really have a preference. I mean, if you want to take a picture or scan it, that's fine. If you want to turn it in on paper, if you want to submit it digitally, I'm pretty flexible, especially on something like this that's kind of a supplemental kind of thing. Yes, that is more than fine. That is more than fine. So that should answer your question about the intro. We made everyone breathe a little easier. Okay? Yes. So let's talk about the book a little bit and some of the things that you need to know as far as the book is concerned. As far as people, what people do you need to know? There's only a few. You need to know, of course, Northup, right? Obviously. I want you to know Eliza. Yes. Oh, okay. So Northup, Eliza. You need to know Ford, Tibbetts, and Epps, and you need to know Bass. Okay.
Eliza's at
She's the one who like walks her
okay.
Yes.
Because she like dives up the river. It's like mentioned in like chapter 4.
Yes. She's the one who's broken hearted, right?
And she died of it.
Yes, basically.
So Northup, Ford, Eliza, Bass, Epps, and
Northup, Eliza, Ford, Tibbetts, Epps, and Bass. So those are the only characters. Anything else in the questions are generalized and more, because of this, why is that, those kind of questions. So you won't necessarily have to know specific characters. That doesn't mean you can't include a specific character in your answer, but those 6 are the ones that there are questions directly related to them. Okay? So Eliza, let's talk about Eliza. So we know that she loses her kids, right? What was her story? How does she end up being sold as a slave?
she was kind of like the mistress of this like white man.
Mm-hmm.
And then once he died, his kids sold her.
No, it was like because like his wife was like super jealous, and then and she actually had a kid with him, and like her kid was sold too.
Yes.
To like get rid of them.
Yes. Absolutely.
One of her kids with him, Emily or
Emmy. Yes, Emmy. What happens with Emmy?
She is not sold because they think that she'll be very pretty later on, which gives a
nasty.
Yeah.
It does. It does. And you should read it that way. He doesn't come out and say it explicitly.
Oh no, but he does.
But he does. He does. She is pretty. She is very light skinned. And so she's going to be kept in New Orleans and eventually put into prostitution. Right? And the story of Eliza itself is a story of sexual exploitation. Because how much choice did she have?
None.
Right? I mean, her options were to go along with what the master said willingly and maybe try to extract an advantage out of that, or not do it willingly and probably still get raped and not have any of the benefits. She clearly implies that was not her first choice. But, she loves her daughter, right? She loves her son, too. Her son's from a previous relationship. And she does, for a time being, have a level of status. Now, whether her master kept his promise and left instructions to free her, and the kid and the daughter was like, no, or whether he lied and said, oh, I'll free you, but never does. That's not entirely clear. I've read it several times, and each time I kind of think, well, maybe this and it. So ultimately, it doesn't matter. What matters is that Eliza's story is about sexual exploitation, and her daughter's going to face the same thing.
And Randall.
But Randall's not going to be sexually exploited. Now, he's going to be sold into slavery, and she's going to lose everything, right? All because think about the master's daughter who sells Eliza, and how hateful she is, and how they trick her. They trick Eliza. They say, "Oh yeah, we're going to go get your freedom papers," and then, that's pretty cruel, right? And I think that it's important for you to recognize that the sexual exploitation that existed in slavery, first off, is exceptionally common, right? Now, people that defended slavery tried to say it wasn't, but it was, all right? And it went everywhere from Patsy and the forced rape to Eliza and kind of her, weird status.
So I was kind of confused because Randall was introduced to Northup before Eliza.
Yes.
Why?
My part of it to me, and I don't know that he's really explicit. My best reading is Randall is probably darker skinned. So, and he's male. So there's probably a gender segregation first and foremost. And then second off, he's darker skinned. So he's being kept with other darker skinned people. Plus they're going to be interested in making sure that, that nothing happens to her. Because, they recognize her value. Because of her attractiveness, right? You see something similar when you see, Northup, and, he starts off, when he first gets to New Orleans, he might get to be a carriage guy, right? Drive a carriage. And then he gets smallpox. Well, what does that do to his status, right? Yeah. Now he's going out to the plantations rather than staying in New Orleans. So this idea of appearance and image is incredibly important, both, in the sense about what kind of job you can have, but also in the sense of sexual exploitation. And it does. And it's part of the legacy of slavery, right? And it's just really, it's really sad. And you see multiple types of it in this book. And you also see what it does to women. And what it does to men, right? In the sense that, think about how awful, the way they talk about Emmy, right? That's just sick. It's just,
She's like little.
Yeah, she's a little girl. And they're,
8, right?
yeah, and they're looking at her, oh, she'll be pretty.
That's a case.
There's just so
That's
many things on top of that whole situation that's wrong.
Well, and she would not have been, they wouldn't have had compunctions as far as her age. I don't think they would have. They wouldn't have raped her at 8, but, she's going to be 12. You're not talking about her being 20. So, that's kind of sick and twisted. But you also have what it does to the women, right? Look at the...
Huh? Patsy.
Well,
Patsy had the worst.
Oh my gosh. And Mistress Epps was so mean to her. She was so jealous. But can you blame... Okay, so you can blame Mistress Epps for being cruel and not getting her soap and throwing things at her.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily her, because Epps was the one who forced Epps.
Yes. And so in many ways, the system went... I hesitate to say it. I don't mean it exactly this way. White women were victimized in a lesser extent, but they were still, if it's your husband and you know he's going out to the slave quarters every night or every week, you have to live with that, right? In Epps's case, his wife knows that he'd rather probably sleep with Patsy than sleep with her. That would be horrendous, right? In the case of Eliza, the daughter is so embarrassed and ashamed of her dad's behavior because he elevated a slave. And she can't tolerate that. They want them gone. They want to pretend like that didn't happen because it was so humiliating. And so I think that it's very important to kind of recognize that you've got this kind of twisted nature to slavery. And it exists, it includes Thomas Jefferson, right?
Yeah.
And so that's part of what makes it sad. And so I wanted to be sure you kind of knew Eliza's story and kind of understood some of that nuance there. It's not just that she loses her kids, because she does, and it breaks her heart and she dies because of it. But it's also the life she was forced to live and how they treat her daughter and really what the ramifications are of sexual exploitation, right? So you definitely have Eliza. With Northup, be a little bit familiar with his capture story. Pay some particular attention to the first chapter or two. The first chapter where he talks about his life in New York before, because there's some lessons we can learn about the North and about how the North functioned. It gets real easy when you read a book like this or you look at slave narratives to kind of treat the South, oh, well, they're just, it was all them, right? And you need to understand that if you look at Northup's story with some analysis and some nuance, what you find out is it wasn't all the South.
Before Northup got taken by the two white men, slavery, whatever, he used to play at like events, right?
Yes.
Okay. What were those events?
They would have been
Parties?
dances, balls.
Okay.
Yes. The difference was he was in demand. I mean, it's like paying a popular musician. I mean, you don't have musicians that are famous then like you do now, but in that region, he would have been fairly well known.
But we need to know the names of the two guys who.
No.
Okay.
You need to kind of be aware of the general framework of his capture, how they persuade him, hey, come play the violin. We hear you're a good violin player.
And
Come
we
on.
have-
There's a circus.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's so random, but it works.
It does.
Somehow it
The also thing is that they don't have their phones to Google it and do
Check
see
up.
if there's actually a circus.
And he
it's just
needed
kind of
money.
word of mouth.
He did. Why does he need money?
His wife is in Saratoga.
Right.
And then also
It's just the natural
Even-
need to
even though he's
better. This drive to just not go up in society, but just to live and have a
Yes.
better life.
yeah.
So if you're looking at
He's
life
still black.
life in the North, he's still a black man. So, and really when you read that first chapter, what you're reading is the story of the American dream, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a man whose father was a slave and was freed, and his father learned to read and had a farm. And then he, here's Northup, he learns to read, he has skills, he's, hardworking, working his way up, and his wife is also hardworking. Now, one of the subtle messages that we see about the North is that unlike for white society, where it would have just been the man working in a middle-class family, in a black family, the woman has to work,
That's
right?
Everyone.
Yes. I mean, this is an all hands on deck. Now they are very middle class, right? But they're hanging on. All it takes is one misstep and somebody losing a job before they could lose it all. So he's got this incentive. I need to earn money. I need to have security, right? And so they're both working, and she's away, and so why not take an opportunity to earn some extra money? I mean, this is a guy who's kind of figured out that he's built a reputation in his area for playing the violin really well. So if he goes on a trip to D.C., who knows what might happen, right? So there's a lot of aspiration in what he's trying to do.
And I think part of it is also because he's grown up in the North. He knows about slavery. He's educated on it.
And
But
he sees slaves coming in.
But it's kind of like that thing that it's it happened to them, but it won't happen to me.
Yeah.
But that's over now. My dad escaped that, so there's no
Yes, that's only in the South. That's
Yeah.
not up here.
Do you think he realized that where he was going was slave territory? Because I think in the beginning of the book he
mentioned it.
because they got him the slave papers, remember? Because they were like, we're
They got
going
him
here.
the free.
So
They
do the papers.
quote unquote got him slave papers because or free papers, not slave papers. And that's a whole trick of the trade too, because remember there's no record of him ever having gotten those papers. So they basically paid a clerk to give false papers and not record them.
And also I think, in hindsight now, we look at it, it's very suspicious that they bring up the papers and he hadn't even thought about it.
Yes.
The fact that he hadn't thought about it also says a lot.
Yeah.
It
Like,
does.
I'll be safe. It doesn't matter. Two
It
strangers. We're going to Washington.
That's
Two
right.
white strangers.
Strangers.
And so you have this kind of environment where clearly, like I said, he's very aspirational, very American dream. He trusts the system, okay? And yet when you start to really kind of, if you start to make some inferences about what he's describing, what you see is a northern system of kind of soft racism, a northern system of kind of paternalism of, well, you know, blacks are fine as long as they stay in their lane. You know, stay in their lane and you know and don't push too hard, right? So you have this kind of subtle racism and paternalism that exists up north. And you'll see it again at the end of the book. When he and his wife gets the letter about, you know, I was kidnapped, and she can't go to the law. She can't go, you know, she has to go to a white man to have a white man advocate for this situation. And the inability to advocate before the law, like we were saying, he couldn't testify. That's a huge problem.
And that's something that most slave hunters took advantage of.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
when they were, when Ford brought him back into the house.
Yes.
Because wasn't that the reason he brought him back into the house after Tibbetts, or
After Tibbetts, yeah.
Tibbetts.
It's actually the overseer, right? So it's Ford's house, like.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, it is confusing because the movie takes that story and kind of removes Chatham, whatever his name is.
Yeah.
Kind of removes him and puts Ford in his place, but it's fundamentally the same story. And the story is rather. Yeah, there's two, and I don't check in there. There might be some more.
There's a couple things.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, just get what you can. Yeah.
Thank you.
So you're absolutely right. So you have, you know, this inability to advocate before the law, and it's really sad, right? And again, it's that soft racism that, you know, when he first writes the beginning of the book, he's talking about his life before. It's very obvious that he wouldn't have seen it that way, but after his experience in D.C., that's going to have a profound impact. And of course, in the South, what's going to happen is that the word of a black man can't do anything. Just be sure Cal 9 comes back. Okay. Are you in stats or?
I'm in
Title. Okay, go ahead. So yeah, that's going to be kind of the issue, right? Is that Ford has to bear witness, because otherwise, a black man. I mean, you could in the South, a white man could commit a crime on a black person or a white person, and if the only witness was a black person, it wouldn't matter.
Oh.
Okay? This is part of the violent nature of the South, right? He talks about how they were always wearing a gun and carrying knives, and you hear, there's one story there where this one guy kills another guy, and it's that scenario, right? That the only witnesses are slaves, but it doesn't matter
What they say.
because because they don't count. They can't appear before the law. Hey. Well, I think we're out of computers. You can check. Are you going to Tuttle's? I don't know. Is anybody not using theirs? Want me to give it up? So yeah. I mean, that's part of the violence in the system. Is that there tends to not be a check, a restraint on, on the violent nature of that society.
It's also weird because it's like in the Fugitive Slave Act of like 1850, it's like the price for like not reporting like a runaway slave is so much more than like
I'm glad you picked that up because and that was kind of part of my intent of having you look at those, which is that you have a fugitive slave law in 1793, which kind of leads us to one of the other big points, which is you need to understand the position of the law when it comes to not only Northup's story, but slavery in general. So we know that the Constitution allows slavery to exist, 3/5 compromise, right? We have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that provides a method, a legal method for a slave owner to recover a runaway slave, right? Fairly, that system doesn't penalize people that live up north that help, right?
There's a fine, but there's no jail time.
There's no, and it's not a bad fine, and
It's just $500.
yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that
It like
people
could be
justify.
worse, but like you can recover from it.
Yes, exactly. And the reality is, you probably don't have, like if you're talking about Massachusetts or even New York, you're not going to have a financial incentive for anybody to rat you out, right? So the person that tells on, oh, hey, they're helping runaway slaves, that person's not going to get anything. Part of the problem with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850
You get incentives.
there's incentives.
Jail time.
Yeah, the punishments are greater. And so you have the law getting tougher in support of slavery. We're supporting slavery, and that's kind of the message that you see when you begin from the establishment of the Constitution in 1787 to 1850, which is that the law is meant to reinforce slavery. Now, part of the irony here is that it is the law that frees Northup, okay?
Yeah.
Because his wife goes to the white Northup, and he takes this and appeals to the New York legislature, and it takes time. And again, she has to work through the white Northup, and that's its own hassle because it takes 3 or 6 months or something like that, and he's got to finish up some business, while Northup's languishing in slavery.
I'll take my time.
Yeah, his sense of urgency is different than hers or Northup's, right?
Because he's not affected by the situation.
He's not directly
If he
affected.
doesn't do anything, it's not like it would hurt him.
It's just out of the goodness of his heart.
Yeah, out of the goodness of his heart, he's going to help fix this situation. And he's the one, and he goes to the law, right? He goes to the state legislature. The state legislature puts him in contact with the senator from Louisiana. The senator from Louisiana says, oh my goodness, we can't let that happen. Yes. We can't let somebody be kidnapped. We have to follow the law.
That's wrong. Slavery, that's fine.
Well, and exactly, because if you're going to use the law to justify the horrible thing that you're doing, then you want to support the law, okay? So there's anti-kidnapping laws. Clearly, you can't go out and kidnap an American citizen. So the Louisiana senator and Waddell, who Northup actually sits and talks to, and Northup has a second-hand kind of transcript of that conversation, right? That's the conversation where they realize, I think we know where Northup might be, right? And they kind of start to put things together. But in that process, you definitely see an emphasis on the role of the law as being the thing that's actually going to free Northup. So it's this weird, twisted, this horrible law that, the Constitution allows slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And then they come in and they say, we just can't let somebody be kidnapped like that, because if you're going to use the law to commit a crime, you better protect the law, right? They don't want to give abolitionists or anybody who wants to get rid of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which you'll find out was horribly unpopular. They don't want to give anybody an excuse to get rid of that. So there's this kind of weird relationship as far as the law is concerned. And then, of course, ultimately what we see is that Northup can't testify. So, really, who's the law working for?
I think
even
it was just like an unexpected effect.
Yes.
To say the least.
Yes, that's exactly what it was. It was an unexpected event. He was able to get word back, because the reality is people were kidnapped all the time. But most of the time they disappeared, and there was no way to get word out. Spanish. He just happened to be incredibly fortunate because of his contact with Bass. And that's the game changer, right? That is what changes everything. So the role of the law is kind of a fascinating development in all of that. Let's see. So let's talk about Ford, Tibbetts, and Epps, okay? The big thing that I want to point out there is that you have a typical Southern social hierarchy. all right? So one of the big things I want you to take from Northup is the sociological kind of study that we see, not only of slave communities and how slave communities interacted, right? I mean, he's very clear. There's some good slaves, there's some bad slaves. There's, slaves are not perfect because they're victims, right? Which is the problem with Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? The slaves are these perfect kind of idyllic, victims, and it paints them in that corner. Whereas Northup's not trying to do that.
He just puts them as people.
As people.
Just like White did.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I think also because she tried to play the victim card so hard, people didn't really believe it as much because they can't relate to it.
Yes. Exactly. Well, and it reinforces
That they're helpless, like.
Yes, reinforces paternalism. That they need our help, And for Northup, somebody who had independence and believed the American dream and worked hard himself, that's kind of insulting, right? I mean, and you kind of sense that when he kind of throws shade at Stowe for writing the way she does. And so I love the fact that he depicts the slave community with authenticity. But he also depicts the white society with authenticity. And he talks about the violence within that society, okay? Well, the other thing you kind of see happening is you see the layers of Southern society. Now, Ford, for example, is going to be kind of the top of the hierarchy, okay? He's going to be the minority of the minority. About 3 to 5% of slave owners in the South would have been like Ford. So not a lot of people. So this falsehood that we have, that it was gone with the wind and everybody had big plantations and slaves, that was so not true. Ford is typical for that kind of echelon.
Is there anyone under the poor white section?
No. Not really. I mean, you've got the guy that's the farm laborer that kind of leases his own work out, with the Epps. He would be a poor white. There's a few characters that, patrollers fall into that category, but none you particularly have to really know.
There was a hermit.
Oh, yeah. So those are the people we're talking about, okay? So the poor whites make up the majority. They don't own slaves at all. They don't own land, right? If they're lucky, they might own a few personal belongings, but they're very transient. They're just, they're not skilled. They're just ordinary people, right? Really, they're about, as far as skill and education and all that kind of stuff, and lifestyle, are really about on the same level as the slaves, okay? With the exception that they're whites.
And then they can move anywhere
They can move anywhere they want, and that, if they hire themselves out, they're not going to have to work as hard. I mean, so they have inherent advantages because of their whiteness, but otherwise they're basically, the same. That is the majority of your South, okay? Now, Ford is the top tier, very small group. Ford owns multiple properties. He has, 50, 75 slaves, something like that, It was uncommon for somebody to own more than 75 to 100, okay? There are a couple of plantations that were that big, but not usually.
In the other narratives that you had us read, there were some that had like 4, 5, 6.
Those are the exceptions. And they're still the exceptions, right? And so when you start to think about the sheer quantity of whites in the South, what it means is that you have a very small group of men that own the majority of slaves, okay? So when you think about the slave system, this is the power of somebody like Ford, is that they own a group. Now, Ford is still kind of on the frontier, if you will. So him being well-to-do looks different than somebody who's, say, in Virginia, where there's lots of old wealth and old money and all that kind of stuff. So that's a part of it too. Plus, a part of what they're doing when you're talking about, like, say, Frederick Douglass's background or Lewis Hughes or whatever, you're talking about people that have had generations of slaves and having kids, and that's part of the natural increase has allowed some of that to happen. Which is why when you have the cotton boom, they're able to sell off so many to the Deep South.
But didn't Ford at one point have financial problems?
He does have, quote unquote, embarrassment. Now, the issue with his embarrassment is that the agricultural system is volatile. Okay, prices rise and fall very rapidly. He has a couple of properties. He's got equity with his land, with his holdings, with his slaves. So he is a man of wealth. So his financial problems are of cash flow, right? It's a temporary financial setback. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't take it seriously. And part of why he takes it seriously is that he's a very careful businessman, right? And part of it's not even his own fault. Part of it's because of his brother, right? So he does have this cash flow problem. But the reality is he's going to be okay. He just, it's just affecting him in that time period, right? Now, this happens very early in Northup's experience, and, he only spends about 2 years between Ford and Tibbetts, which, when you think about the 1800s, it's not very long.
Wait, so Ford's brother was Tanner, right?
Tanner Ford was his uncle, something like that.
Okay, and he was the one that used Christianity in a different way.
Yes, as retribution. Like, you have to obey because God says you have to.
Tanner was Mrs. Ford's brother.
That's what, yes.
Didn't you also kind of say like slavery was kind of in the Bible, like saying
Yes.
that all this stuff that
Yes.
they were doing?
Yeah, the classic defense of slavery using scripture.
This is Tanner, right?
That's Tanner.
Okay.
Yes.
But
And
in the way that Northup described him, it's like he's not a bad person,
no,
but he's not as good as Ford.
right. Well, and okay, so let me finish describing Ford, and then we'll talk about that. So Ford has this temporary financial setback, but he's still a man at the upper end of society because of his property ownership, because of his slaves, and he's going to be somebody that has social status, that has political influence. If nothing else, political influence at the local level. Now, you could argue he doesn't have political influence at the state level because he's too far out the frontier, but certainly locally, he's going to have influence. And you see that social status come to play when you look at how he treats his slaves. Remember, this is somebody that treats his slaves fairly well. He lets Henry have a Bible. Henry's learning to read. He's allowed to get married, right? I mean, Ford recognizes their marriage relationship, which is highly unusual. He allows his slaves, a little bit of independence to grow their own food, to make a little extra money. Like, he really kind of, and part of that is good business sense, right? Let's incentivize productivity and effort. And yes, that means allowing my slaves a degree of humanity, right? A degree of agency in what they do. But make no mistake, people in that community are going to look at him and go, well, it's a good thing he's rich or has a bunch of land. It's a good thing he's Ford because anybody else, right? So he's allowed to push the eccentricity that he wants to treat his slaves better, and he justifies it as a business plan, and he can get away with it because of who he is, okay? Just like Eliza's master could get away with having her, live in the house because of his wealth, and the other lady that lives like that, right? I mean, so you have those things happening.
When we were talking, what were we just talking
We're talking about Tanner.
about? I lost that.
Okay, so you have Ford kind of acting in this position, all right? So Ford has that social status. Now Tanner, on the other hand, this is a man who has wealth, uses, as opposed to using religion as a comfort, right, as a way of extending humanity to his slaves, he uses religion as a way of reinforcing this system. Here's what I think, and you guys can think what you want. I think that in a lot of ways, Tanner is more authentic than Ford. Ford's behavior, his effort to create humanity, right, to treat his slaves better, in a lot of ways shows that he knows the system's wrong. He wouldn't be doing that if he didn't recognize the system's broken, right? So he's trying to make it better, and he's getting away with it, but he's not fundamentally changing the system. He's working with the system and exploiting the system and benefiting from the system and continuing to have his status and his wealth and all that kind of stuff. Tanner, at least, doesn't think anything's wrong with the system. He believes in it, right? The Bible says it's right, so it's got to be right. I mean, fundamentally, Tanner's not a brutal person in the sense of Epps, right? So, not that Tanner treats the slaves as well as Ford does, but he's not necessarily treating his slaves as bad as Epps is. And at least he kind of has this sense that his belief that the system is good. It's not, and we all know that. But at least maybe, I don't know, you can give him credit for being real. I don't know. I tend to judge Ford harshly, right? Because in my opinion, his behavior tells me he knows it's wrong.
Ford was consciously being immoral while Tanner was unconscious.
Yes.
It was like his ignorant bliss. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Very much so. And so I think that's an interesting kind of dynamic that you see there. So they're at the upper echelon. So underneath, Ford is going to be somebody like Epps. Epps is a man that starts off as an overseer, known as a slave breaker, because he's good at, managing slaves and extracting labor from them and keeping them under control. He gets money. He gets enough money that he's able to marry well. That allows him to then lease a plantation, and then he owns slaves. Now, he doesn't own as many slaves as Ford, but he owns anywhere from about 10 to 15.
Epps was the one that married up.
Yes.
Which is something that women usually do, but in this case, Epps does.
I think what that shows you, I don't think it's necessarily something that women do. I think what it shows you is that in Southern society, that women, that it was, getting married was precarious, right? It could have a lot to do with the particular region they're in and how many women you have versus how many men and how that dynamic works out. He clearly marries up and she marries down, right? We don't know why, right? Northup doesn't tell us, we just don't know. But we know that he does marry up. And that gives him a way to lease a plantation from one of her relatives, her brother, or her uncle, or father, or something. And then he has slaves, and he goes from that and earns enough money that he's able to buy his own plantation. Okay? But he's still, so he's his single property owner, and his slaves never outnumber 15, right? So he's fairly what I would call upper middle class. And he's going to be a larger percentage of your overall slave owners in the South. Still not the majority, okay, but a bigger number. You're going to have a lot more that are in that range. You'll have more that are kind of in the middle, which could be somebody who owns or leases property and has like 3, 4, 5 slaves. They would be kind of in the middle. An overseer like Ford's, who's really good at what he does and works for a really well-to-do man, would kind of be in the middle class, so that wouldn't be too bad. So this is kind of where Epps starts off. So Epps in and of himself is an American aspiration story, right? Starts off as an overseer in the middle, and through good business, managing slaves, marrying up, gets to the next level, right? So overseers are there, the ones that only own a few slaves are there, and people like Bass are in that level because he's very, very skilled. He's really good at what he does. He's dependable, right? And that social level is what allows Bass to be eccentric too, right? So Bass says all kinds of crazy stuff and argues with people about the negatives of slavery, and everybody just kind of laughs it off.
Well, it's most likely because they needed a skill.
Yes, exactly. If he hadn't been as good at what he was doing, they wouldn't have put up with it, right? So again, it's social status plays a big role in how eccentric you can be, how much you can buck the system, all that kind of stuff. So you've really got the overseer, Bass. You've got people in the middle, right? And again, you're talking about 15-25% of the people, right?
Would you say, sorry, I'm kind of going back, but would Solomon and Epps are kind of opposites, but they're both going towards the American dream.
Yes, yes, I absolutely would. You know, you have Epps following the American dream as it's perceived in the South, and you have Northup following the American dream as it's perceived in the North, right? With the caveat that Northup is black, and that inherently disadvantages him. And Epps is white, and that inherently advantages him. So, yes, absolutely. So there's kind of an interesting, and I don't know that Northup intends that, but I see that anyways. So you have the middle class, and you're going to have a lower middle class, right? And you could merge lower middle class and poor whites. I think there's a little distinction. Somebody like Tibbetts has kind of a skill. He's not great at what he does, but he can basically do the job. And so in an area where there's not a lot of skilled workers, and that's an important aspect of Southern society, there are not a lot of skilled workers. So they're desperate to have people that can, do carpentry, wheelwrights, all that kind of stuff, right? So Tibbetts can do it. He just doesn't do it very well. He's not very dependable. He's not very consistent. But because they desperately need that, he gets away with kind of having a little bit of a position. But you can tell in the interactions between he and Ford and between he and Chatham that he really, he's down on the totem pole socially. Chatham, whatever his name is, the overseer for Ford.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that would be Ford, the overseer, and then
Tibbetts. Yeah. And so Tibbetts is kind of, I would put him beneath Bass, even though technically they're both carpenters, but there's clearly a difference in skill and in dependability and how they're respected. Is their age? I mean, Bass seems to be older, Tibbetts seems to be younger. That could factor in.
Also, Tibbetts seems to be more temperamental.
Yes, more temperamental. I mean, so there's interesting things like that make Tibbetts kind of more fluid. Now, what's fascinating about this is that Tibbetts has a prime opportunity to pull himself up, right? Because of the financial difficulties Ford has, he essentially gives Northup as collateral, right? Because Tibbetts is doing carpentry work, and basically says, here, you get to hold on to, I'll pay you back. You can use my slave, and you own half, and I own half. Now, what that does is it allows Ford a chance to control where Northup is going. Hopefully, I'm sure what he's thinking in the back of his head is he'll get a chance to buy him back, right? Because he doesn't want to let him go. But because of his financial problems, he's going to have to let Tibbetts use him. And this is a great opportunity for Tibbetts if he would not be so temperamental, right? Because he could totally use Northup to double the amount of work he's doing, to do better work, to do more work, and maybe buy Northup outright, or maybe save up his money so he can have his own place. But he doesn't do that. Why?
Because he was just born. He had that racist mentality.
Yes, but it's not just the race. It is the racist mentality. But what specifically triggers?
Isn't it because he does his job better than he does?
Yes. Northup is more skilled. And if you're raised if you're a poor white, kind of lower middle class white, the best thing you have on somebody is your skin color. And everything about your society tells you that you are better because of your skin color. So when you see the evidence on a daily basis that you are not better, right, you're going to start to get a little cranky. Yes, absolutely a superiority complex. And part of that superiority complex is driven by his lower social status, right? So you get kind of a furball of a lot of different things kind of influencing Tibbetts. Yeah, that ultimately leads him to, try to kill him, to set Northup up for this terrible, where either way he goes, he's challenging the word of a white man.
But it was so funny. In my eyes, it's so funny now to think about it, because you thought you're gonna get whipped, but you whipped someone instead.
I know. Well, and somebody in the last class pointed out that Tibbetts ultimately ends up afraid of Northup.
Oh yeah.
Even though he wants to kill him and he tries to get a couple of his friends to lynch him and all that kind of stuff, he knows Northup can be, what, and he's afraid of it. right? And so I think that's an interesting nuance.
I can't even imagine the embarrassment
Oh
that
yeah.
he must have had
Beat by a
after
black
being
guy.
found
Yes.
whipped by someone who was by
Yes.
a black man who worked for him.
Yes. like there's all kinds of complications with that part of the story.
That
Like,
part felt good.
phones back
Oh,
then,
that
we
felt
recorded
so
that.
good.
it did. And it speaks to the fact that slaves did resist by fighting back.
It also was hard to believe for me because, like, just that quick thinking that Northup did several times with,
Yeah.
like, being attacked by different people.
Yeah.
Like, specifically Tibbetts, like, his, like, just the, it felt like something that you would read in, like, a dystopian novel or
Yeah.
something. Not something that actually happened where somebody was about to stab you in the back and then you
Yeah.
Look him instead.
pull a fast one. You pull a fast one on.
Yeah. Well, and that whole scenario, right? So, you know, he knows to go to Ford.
And
Northup
he traced that other plantation owner.
Yes, completely.
That was crazy.
Wait,
Well, of course, that tells you right there that the other plantation owner, you know, I mean, this is somebody that's working really, really hard, right? I mean, you know, so they're living in a world that is really focused on their own kind of financial security, and it's precarious enough that he doesn't have time to worry about what somebody else is doing. You know, and Northup knows, he understands that because Ford owns part of him, that's where he needs to go to alleviate the situation. That Tibbetts cannot do, like he's got to get to where Ford is. Because if he doesn't, right, if he doesn't get to his property where his overseer, where Ford is, then Tibbetts can do what he wants and nobody will say anything about it because Tibbetts will make up the story that he wants to have told. And all he needs is a white person willing to corroborate what he says. Which he had, yeah. So Northup knows that is his recourse. And so he does, and he goes, and you have the overseer acting with actually a great deal of courage, but you also see the tension of the social situation. The overseer's not that much more socially advanced. He is higher up than Tibbetts, but he knows as a white man, he has to be very careful how much he defends a black man, okay? Especially as an overseer, because that could destroy his career, right? And you also already have a problem with the fact that Ford is already seen as being a little too kind to his slaves. And so the overseer has to be, it's a very difficult situation to navigate. So his recourse is to say, you only own half, unless you're willing to pay up right now, I can't let you take it because I can't trust you, right? And so that's what's able to kind of preserve Northup's life.
I would not be able to think that fast and be like, yes,
Oh, yeah.
because you own half of him and not all of him.
Exactly.
You can't kill him.
Exactly. And then, of course, this is part of the issue when you start talking about Ford and his culpability, which is ultimately his decision is, well, I don't want to be seen, you know, standing up for or going out on a limb for this slave that beat his master, right? I mean, Northup has beat Tibbetts, and everybody knows it, right? Yeah, and so Ford can't. I mean, he could if he was willing to take that risk, but he's not.
Because he's a smart business.
Because he's made it so far, like,
yeah,
he has so much to lose.
yeah. And so who does he sell Northup to but to Epps, who as an overseer had a reputation for breaking strong-willed slaves. Okay? And again, to me that screams culpability of Ford. Ford has to, I mean, I think you have to hold him accountable, like in a moral sense, in my opinion, right? I mean, some people view it differently, and they say, well, you know, he had so much to lose. What could he do? Maybe
not what he did.
I mean, you know, I don't know. I mean, it would be a difficult position to be in. There's no question. So you've got that social status between Tibbetts and Epps and Ford, and how they represent different levels, and how the different levels affect how they behave, right? And the circumstances of their life. And so I think that's an important piece to take with you, because when we talk about the development of the Civil War, you've got these poor whites, the ones that leashed themselves out, right? The ones that behaved as patrollers, right, to make sure that slaves weren't running around without passes and stuff. That those are the poor whites that make up the majority of the population, right? So So that's what you have to keep in mind. So when you start talking about, the Civil War being fought, it's predominantly fought by those people, by the people in kind of that middle, lower middle, and poor white section. That what did they really have invested in preserving slavery, right? If you're a poor white, does it really benefit you? I mean, you have to be able to save the money to buy a slave. And yet if you're X, you want to preserve slavery, because or Tanner even, because owning slaves, owning people has been your avenue to moving up in the world. And so it kind of creates a very difficult situation. So you want to be sure you know the social structure. What about resistance? Resistance to slavery and reinforcement of slavery.
Wait, say that again.
What about resistance to slavery and reinforcement of slavery?
What do you what?
Like, in other words, how did slaves resist? And how was slavery reinforced? Like, how was it difficult for slaves to resist? What made it so that they were kind of trapped in the system? And yet, how did they find ways to push back?
There were all those laws about how slaves couldn't go anywhere without a signed letter.
Yes, the pass system was very important. The pass system, yes. And the patrollers that enforced it. Yeah. Who else? Go ahead.
You can go.
I lost
Kind of like, I feel like they were, okay, so you know how like they celebrate and everything, they kind of reinforce the slavery themselves because they're singing songs about it, they like the holidays, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, the holidays are on one hand an escape from it, and yet at the same time it kind of lulls you into its own place. Yeah. Stephen?
I feel like one thing that would have like kept a slave was that even if the fact that they successfully escaped, living on your own, like creating stuff for yourself is hard enough as it is.
Yes.
You kind of know a skilled worker
Yeah.
as a slave. So.
Exactly. If all you, especially if you're somebody that was born and brought up in that system, if all you were taught to do ever was pick cotton, when you're out there, how are you gonna get food, find shelter, all that kind of stuff?
There's no use in picking cotton when you're free, because now you have to know what to read, how to get a job, what skill set you need.
And that's pretty terrifying. If I mean, there's a saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So that could be part of it.
There's also the fact that
It's also the fact that they wanted to be free, obviously, but Northup talks about there's a point whenever they want to just get to the better level of the slavery, you know what I mean? They want to just go to the uptown
Yes.
And so it's they're not setting their goal to be free. I mean that's their head, but their goal is just to move up in the social hierarchy of the slave.
Freedom is a vague concept to them because they have no experience of it. And so, and he says this to Patsy, that she kind of has a vague awareness of what freedom would be. But it's hard for her to define, so therefore, for her, it's, I just want to borrow soap, and that creates its own reinforcement.
I feel like what Stephen said, or whatever, it's obviously every slave wanted to be free. That's in everybody's mind. But it's when you're free, what will you do? Especially with people that have new families, they have some children that are also being bred up to learn all this stuff. What are you gonna?
Are you gonna walk away? I mean, you know how precarious life is as a slave. So are you gonna voluntarily walk away from your kids? Are you gonna, or all that kind of stuff? Stephen.
Okay, this is kind of an unrelated question. Well, first, this is kind of two questions. So factory jobs with Northup are relatively unskilled, right?
Yes, for the most part. But you have lots of immigrants coming in, right? And the factory jobs are different unskilled, right? If you're talking about agriculture, being unskilled in agriculture is one thing. Being unskilled in a factory is another. Because a lot of the factory work involves, pushing things, pushing buttons, threading things. And they can teach people to do that, but that's where that soft racism in the North comes in, and there tends to be a preference for hiring immigrants as opposed to blacks.
So there's also the thing of when you run away, if you run away, people will be looking for you constantly.
Yes.
Like, those patrollers are always around, they're patrolling up and down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Kind of piggybacking on that, like, I think one of the reasons why there was less resistance was because the people, like, they saw people who resisted and they saw what happened to them.
Yes.
And I think that was a big reason why, because it made the, like, the pros versus the cons.
I mean, because what would happen is they would force you to witness them being hung, them being whipped, or whatever, to make a spectacle out of it, to reinforce the idea you don't want to do this. The psychology.
So when, I kind of don't like Northup for this one reason. Is the fact that when he was going to the cage to be free, he encountered Patsy, and he just left her there. Like, no comment came out of his mouth. Maybe in his mind he thought of something, but he wasn't able to console her.
What would he say?
That's the thing.
Like what would he say? She doesn't understand. Like, again, her concept of freedom is this vague thing. And on top of that, he's still in a very tenuous position. They're still in Louisiana, right? I mean, he's being set free from the law. But the law at the same time says Patsy belongs to Epps. So if they're going to say the law should free Northup, they have to say that the law says Patsy stays there.
It's like, don't bite the hand that feeds you.
Yeah, I mean,
don't let the gift horse in the mouth.
Yeah, if he tries to do anything for her, he runs the risk of losing it all. Right? Steven?
One thing, one limiting factor that like kept slaves in captivity, which I think applies to like human beings in general. Human beings aren't really born to be like revolutionary. We're born to just get by. So that's like why all these major problems in history kind of stay problems. We're not actively trying to fix them. We're just trying to make life better.
You're just trying to survive, right? That's absolutely true. And don't forget the influence of the environment, right? The swamps, the alligators, the water, those kinds of things that have a huge impact on that. All right, so let me go through a couple things because we get out of here, what, 2:25? 26. Okay, so I got 10 minutes. So I think you guys have a good idea about how slavery is reinforced. Very quickly, how did the slaves resist? What did they do within this reinforced system? How do they push back?
The little bit of like control they could get, like with the fish traps and things like that.
Yes, providing their own food, having those little areas of agency.
It's like for board, if you treat them well, they will do work that you want. But if you don't treat them well, they'll do the minimum.
That's exactly. And that's part of the inefficiency of the system. So they'll do the bare minimum. How else would they try to resist?
When someone was like whipped, they would take care of them, bandage them.
Yes.
And like with Northup, when he was in charge of whipping other people,
He would just be like,
he would just kind of
Yes.
make it. It was a lot of acting. As an actor, I'm kind of impressed.
Yes, there's a lot of that going on. And I think that's an important characteristic to kind of note, that you have a lot of kind of deception going on, okay? Now, you have to understand it, and some of this, like, so when you talk about slaves and how they reacted, a lot of times they deceived their owners, like Northup does. They would play helpless. I don't know what to do. I need you to tell me what to do, right? Sometimes they would break their own tools, right? And be like, gee, I don't know how to fix this, so you're going to have to tell me how to fix it because I don't know what to do. And that kind of helplessness, that kind of deception becomes a justification. And you see this a little bit with Tanner, that blacks can't do these things, right? Well, as the defense of slavery develops, they start to argue that, well, they have to be enslaved because, well, they're not smart, and they're deceptive, and they're lazy, and they never know how to do anything. And that justifies the way they treat them. It justifies Jim Crow segregation, right? You even hear that nonsense today. When people talk about welfare or something, oh, well, you know, food stamps. Well, that is that's the same trope, right? And what it is it was a reaction by the slaves to push back, to carve within some independence by pretending to be less than they were. Because they knew who they were. They had their own slave community, and so they knew how that game was played, but white people didn't. So they were left saying, oh, well, they're lazy, they're deceptive.
They did what they had to survive.
Yes, exactly. All right, so very quickly, we talked about Southern society. We talked about the role of the law. We've talked about kind of racial interaction in the North and the South. The last thing that I think I want to mention is the concept of arguments about slavery, specifically the discussion between Bass and Epps. Okay, there's a couple of pages there where Bass is talking to Epps about slavery. And Epps is basically saying, well, they're basically monkeys. They can't do anything
because you don't give them books.
You don't. Yeah, he makes this point. How do you know? You haven't tried, right? And I think that's a very powerful kind of argument about slavery. You also have Bass arguing about debt, and that fundamentally slavery is based on this debt cycle that Bass finds immoral, being in debt to somebody, right? So you have an interesting, you certainly see that with Ford, right? How the debt cycle kind of creates some complications for him. So you have that. You also have Bass talking about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and this idea of natural rights and having this debate with Epps over this whole scenario. And so I think it's really important to kind of realize what Bass is saying and how that argument kind of plays out. Because that is something that we'll see over and over and over again.
Would you call him a federalist?
Yes, I think when Bass is making that argument, it's a little after the whole federalism thing, but he's clearly not buying the idea that states should be able to control so much, or at least in relation to slavery, right? So I definitely think that you could make that case. But Bass, and it's this conversation that tells Northup he can trust Bass, right? He talked to the other guy, the one that leaked out.
Snake.
Yeah,
Snake.
And I hate that dude. He betrayed him, but he realizes that Bass is different. And then of course Bass, when he's confronted with Northup's story, he makes the choice to put aside his opportunity and the money he's been earning because he's this unique skilled laborer and says, you know what, I'm done with this system. I'm not going to pretend he's been taught. It's kind of like people that are Twitter warriors, and they retweet, and then all of a sudden it clicks in their head that it doesn't matter how much I tweet, it's what I do, and it's like he has that moment, and I think that it's really important to kind of realize that he makes that moral judgment. Now, again, you could defend Ford by saying Bass had less to lose. He was from Canada. He could take his skills anywhere, and that is true. I still think he takes a huge risk, and he certainly risks his life. He doesn't have kids. I mean, that could be a part of it as well. So I think there's a lot of kind of interesting stories there. One of the other resistance things that I forgot to mention was somebody like Celeste, who basically hides out, like is sick and she knows she's not going to get a break, so she basically takes a break herself. So you do have slaves that take agency, but their effectiveness depends on who they are and how they've begun to acquire certain skills, and they've begun to acquire kind of an intellect or whatever. Okay, so I think that's kind of interesting. So any other last minute questions?
I don't have a question. I was just going to say, I think part of when he was Bass and Epps are arguing, I've heard this before, the argument isn't to change the other person's mind, it's to help people know what you think is that they're not alone.
Yes.
So I think kind of that applies because Northup heard that and he was able to get help.
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. And it's an interesting, it's a good story, and it gives you such an insight into how the system of slavery worked, how it was reinforced, how it interacted on itself. Yeah, really. I did share. I tweeted out a video that I showed. I've only gotten to show it to 7th period. But it's a video from a plantation outside of New Orleans called the Whitney Plantation. And it's a plantation that's dedicated to the slave perspective. And it's a relatively new museum. So I encourage you, to go to Twitter, go to my Twitter account or whatever. You should be able to see the video. And it was really good. And it kind of dovetails with kind of what we've been talking about the impact of slavery and yet how ultimately it is a story of resiliency and how families take that experience and yet, but we have to talk about it. Like, we can't pretend that it didn't happen. We can't pretend that whiteness didn't play a role in what happened, because it did. And that doesn't, and the guy that started this Whitney Plantation is a really good part where he's like, I don't feel guilty as long as I'm doing something. As long as I'm actively trying to resist the perpetuation of this kind of mentality, I don't have to feel guilty. But there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that white people in the South, in America, did these things. And to acknowledge it and recognize it and own it, and then choose to do better, right? And I think that is kind of the dilemma that we face when we talk about modern racism. It's so much easier to just, oh gosh, it's so complicated, I don't want to talk about it. We have to talk about it, because it's ugly. It's ugly when you talk about things like sexual exploitation and abuse and murder. It is ugly, but it's a part of how our country was created. The cotton economy is the foundation of our economy, right? So anyway, so check that video out, and I think that's it. I recorded this for McKinley and for Ashlyn, so I'll probably share this as well. So if you get home and you're like, oh gee, I really want to spend another 90 minutes. You can do that, but I will share it out, even though it's technically only for 2 people. So just study that. Don't stress about the intro assignment, right? If you follow kind of this guide that we kind of went over today, you should be in good shape. Okay.
That was some A1 sauce right
A1 sauce. May I text Alex?
Yes, you sure may.
I like to notes on that, and I